And let me just say, as I start out here this evening, that on February 1 of this year, 2024, about 2 or 3 months ago, the Guinness Book of World Records certified the African American Civil War Memorial as the monument with more names than any other monument in the world. Now, let me just repeat that because I like the way it sounds when I say it out loud. The African American Civil War Memorial in Washington, D.C. has more names than any other monument in the world. Now, I know some of y'all calculators are running, but let me just tell you, the monument that's in second place is the Vietnam Memorial, which has 58,000 names. We have 209,145 names on this memorial wall. And each one of those names is backed up by a document in the National Archives here in Washington, D.C. And if the people in that...
This program is a video presentation of the Civil War Roundtable of the District of Columbia. Please consider making a monetary gift to support our efforts to bring Civil War history to viewers like you. Visit CWRTDC.org to learn how.
Well, first, it's a great pleasure to introduce a man that I've known for not that long, probably 3 or 4 years. And he's a man of, as you will soon find out, a man of vision, accomplishment, and most importantly, persistence. He started, as you read his bio, he started his life in Georgia. And then he got involved in the civil rights movement down in Mississippi, registering voters. And at that time, he both experienced personally, and he saw the experience of racial segregation and the scars of slavery. Now, that said, I see a man here who's devoted his life, his entire life, to fighting this, doing it in so many ways. Coming here to Washington, being a DC council member, taking an area of town that really, a lot was lost in 1968 and the riots that followed. That whole U Street corridor, a lot of buildings, businesses were burned out, businesses closed, homes lost. And it was not a place you wanted to go there. Well, things change. And it's in large part to this man. That was his passion. And that is restore that corridor, bring it back to life. And that's what he did. And you've been at it for a long time, Frank, and admire you for it. You don't run into that very often. And but the vision was, if you had something up there unique that would draw people up there, it could do a couple things. One is it could tell the story of the African Americans who fought for our country, the 200,000 of them plus, and draw people up there to see this memorial. And they went to work in, I think, 1992, thereabouts. And they raised 5.5 now, okay, to build a monument, a beautiful monument. And when you think about all the monuments here in town, how many really capture the story of African Americans? You have the one in Lincoln Park, which is controversial. You can go over to the National Gallery, you can see a copy of the Lafarge's 54th Massachusetts. And after that, you're not going to find very much. Now you do. And it's in large part because of people like Frank and his team that made this happen. So that said, well, if you have a monument, how do you tell the story? People are looking at it and what's going on. So Frank and his team, they put together a museum or exhibits. But again, at that time, they didn't have any space, so they went to wherever space was available and they moved these exhibits around. It was the moving museum around, and would bring people up there and they'd see the museum, and then they got the story. Well, finally, thanks to Frank, he hit it. And there's a building up there called the Grimsey School, a very historic building. It was renovated. And don't ask how, but Frank did it again. 15,000 square feet in this renovated building in which to place a permanent museum. Well, that said, he's somehow gotten the money for the building out of that. But it will open hopefully in next year, early next year. But he's going to need some help. Operating a museum as an NGO, not for profit, it's going to cost some money to get it off the ground. So if you have creative ideas, go for it. I might add also, I was introduced to Frank. I never knew of Frank. I'd been doing a lot of work over in Alexandria. And my wife, who was a tour guide, and late Carol Bassett, also a tour guide, they said, you know, you're playing around with a story here in Alexandria, and that's a pretty awful story. And indeed it is. If you want to see the more triumphal side of the story, go over and meet Dr. Smith, which I did. And so we have to take the two stories together. The awfulness that happened in Alexandria with the slave traders, and then the other part of the story of the guys who survived all of that, were shipped down to Natchez. And then when they were liberated by Abraham Lincoln, or authorized to be released, and they joined the U.S. Army. And boy, that made a difference in the war. So Frank, the floor is yours.
First of all, let me say thank you to the Civil War Roundtable and to my good friend Bill Dickinson, who we've not known each other for a few years, 2 or 3 years, but we've been joined at the hip ever since. He and I've traveled around together, many meetings, and he's now got me involved in this story of the great Trail of Tears from Alexandria down to Natchez, Mississippi. And it's a good way to introduce my talk, because what I said to Bill was, you know, I don't particularly like the thought of me crying for 600 miles from here to Natchez, Mississippi, only to end up in a cemetery. So we got to figure out a better way to tell this story. And then I found out from talking to people on that end that Natchez, Mississippi had a fort there that only existed during the time of the Civil War. It was a fort, Fort McPherson. And Fort McPherson had about 6 regiments there, African-American regiments. Some of these regiments were raised from soldiers in that area too, who had been enslaved, and now they're in the Union Army, and they were at that fort. And then I learned, as I dug a little deeper, that some of the boards that had been used to build slave pens for slaves in that area had been torn up and used for fortification to build this fort. I said, okay, now I can tell that story right there. Some of those guys who have been enslaved end up in Union Army. They get to put rifles on their shoulders, bullets in their pockets, walk out on these battlefields, and in some cases, they face their owners. I know about that because one of my board members is a descendant of one of those soldiers, and his father, who was a white enslaver, his great-great-grandfather, 5 greats, and his father saw each other in uniform. One in the Union uniform, I won't tell you which, and the other one in a Confederate uniform. Take your pick. And he said they agreed that they wouldn't shoot each other. They would shoot over each other's head instead of killing each other. So they must have been friendly, because at the end of the time, that owner, when he died, he willed some of his land to my board member's family, which they still own. So there's a way to tell this story where it makes sense and where also you can get a little enjoyment out of it. So Bill and I have been working with the mayor of Natchez, Mississippi now, who you saw on that screen earlier, to build a monument for those soldiers. The African-American Civil War Museum Memorial, which has 209,000 names of African-American soldiers, we are supplying the city of Natchez with 8,000 names of soldiers who were stationed at that site in Natchez. And we showed them how to put them up, and as long as they put them up the way we tell them, they'll be certified and they'll be backed up by our monument here in DC. This is just one of the monuments that we're working with. That's the result of us having started this a long time ago, talking about these African-American soldiers. And so I wanted to tell that story because, so a good Baptist preacher once said, he said, reading the Bible is just telling old stories if you don't find a way to make it relevant to today. Well, here's how we make it relevant to Natchez, Mississippi. They now have a way to tell this story. And I've said to them what we do here in DC, and that is that one of the things you should do with this museum when you get these names up there is this. You should now make sure all the kids in the Natchez public school system visit this museum so they can hear this story, because our people need to hear some stories about us having worked so hard for our freedom, sacrificed, and done things that made this country what it is today. And so I'm pleased to join with him now. I can take that trip down. He and I are going to take a trip down the Mississippi River together, tourist trip. But I do look forward to it. So look forward to being able to do that. And so I've had a chance really to do something that has really been very meaningful to me and to people, to my family and friends. And let me just say, as I start out here this evening, that on February 1 of this year, 2024, about 2 or 3 months ago, the Guinness Book of World Records certified the African American Civil War Memorial as the monument with more names than any other monument in the world. Now, let me just repeat that, because I like the way it sounds when I say it out loud. The African American Civil War Memorial in Washington, D.C. has more names than any other monument in the world. Now, I know some of you all calculators are running, but let me just tell you, the monument that's in second place is the Vietnam Memorial, which has 58,000 names. We have 209,145 names on this memorial wall. And each one of those names is backed up by a document in the National Archives here in Washington, D.C. And if the people in Natchez do the names the way I told them to do them, theirs will also be backed up by those same documents here in the National Archives. And so we're planting seeds around the country like that. We're working with a museum in Atlanta, Georgia. We're working with another museum in Indianapolis, Indiana. I'll be traveling over there soon with some of my staff people who work with that museum. So we're finding a way to get this story out here and making it fresh enough so people can look at it again. Now, how does that pertain to Abraham Lincoln? Lincoln scholars know this already. Lincoln gets elected in 1860, and by the way, just to make it a little bit more relevant to today, Lincoln gets elected in 1860. You all know he won. He lost the popular vote. He won the Electoral College. He actually won the Electoral College. He actually won an Electoral College, and some of the Confederates challenged the election because the state of Ohio had allowed a few black people to vote in the state of Ohio. And citing the Dred Scott decision, which said that the founding fathers never intended that black people, neither slave nor free, would be citizens, they said, well, Ohio couldn't allow black people to vote because you had to be a citizen to vote. Dred Scott said they couldn't be citizens, so how could they vote? And there are a lot, about 9,000 black people who had moved from Connecticut. They were what they call mulattoes, who had moved from Connecticut to escape bigotry in Connecticut, which is kind of interesting. Moved to Ohio, which was more friendly territory, and so they were allowed to vote. Now, as is the case in Georgia now, we don't know who they voted. Maybe they did vote. I assume they did vote. We don't know who they voted for. I assume they would have voted for Abraham Lincoln. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But these people were trying to use it as a pretext to disqualify the Ohio votes so that President Lincoln wouldn't get elected president of the United States. Now, Congress took a look at this because, they had to challenge him in the House of Representatives. And Congress took a look at this, and they said, if we start examining the criteria by which one of these states allow people to vote, this election will never be over with. So they basically said, you all get out of here. This election's over. Let's get on with the next one. And so I wanted to say that because I know we've seen some more modern challenges here with Gore the Gore case in Florida. But in this case, Lincoln himself starts out with that. Now Lincoln, people say, was a moderate. He was not a radical about racism and freedom and democracy. He was a moderate. They're comparing him, of course, to what was the Republican Party platform at the time, which had a lot of really incendiary language in there. Like they said, slavery had no place in modern civilization, things like that. Now, Lincoln was not that far yet. Y'all know that, right? He was one of those people who was, as far as he got at that time, was to say that the Constitution had recognized slavery. So he was prepared to sort of deal with it in those states where it was established, but he did not believe that he thought that the government could keep it where it was in the South and not allow it to spread if it wanted to stop the spreading of it. of course, the Confederates wanted to be able to, so they figured it was their slaves, their property. They could buy and sell it, do what they do with all their other properties. So in a way, he starts out politically in a position where by the time he gets elected, the Confederacy had decided that they were going to secede. And let me just also add, having been a politician myself, they made this a way, the freeing of blacks a wedge issue in the 1860 campaign. The South went around the country saying, if you vote for Abraham Lincoln, we are going to secede from the Union. They didn't just sneak up on them and say, now you've done something. They made it a wedge issue. They went around the country campaigning against Lincoln, saying that if you vote for Abraham Lincoln, we are going to secede, despite the fact that we think of him as having a moderate position. And they did what they said. By the time in the first states, Georgia, Alabama, my state of Georgia and Alabama, South Carolina, by the end of the calendar year have seceded from the Union. And President Lincoln doesn't even get sworn in until March. So I like to point out to people that Lincoln didn't start this war because he wasn't even president yet. He didn't get to be, he had to be sworn in to be president of the United States. By the time he was sworn in, about 7 of these southern states had already seceded from the Union. And so he stepped into a burning house that was on fire already. And of course, not long after that, in early April, when they finally fired the first shots, and now he's in the middle of a war. He just got in office, and he's got to figure out how to raise an army and hold the country together, and all kind of complicated political things that presidents have to do. And he spends his whole political life working at that, because at the end of the day, he himself is assassinated. So he spends the rest of his political life doing what is really intriguing to me, and I'm sure to all of the Lincoln scholars in here and Civil War Roundtable. It really an intriguing story of how he maneuvered his way through all of this, building an army, because there was no army. I think the U.S. Army had about 75,000 men at the time, and there was virtually no army to speak of. He had to build an army, and then the South had succeeded and taken their state National Guards and turned them into the Confederate Army. So he couldn't use those soldiers. He had to build his own army from these northern states, and then he had to find a way, of course, to get a military victory in the middle of all of this. Now, from my point of view, here is this sleeper group of people who have an interest in all of this. These 3.9 million enslaved people here in the United States who are part of this and who have an interest in this. And Frederick Douglass would say the first time when the first shot was fired, he started telling people, this is the war from which we're going to get our freedom. This Douglas' words himself. Lincoln doesn't know that yet, and I'm sure the Army doesn't know that yet. But Frederick Douglass has already predicted that this is going to be the war where we get our freedom. And you all know Douglas not only he eventually convinced President Lincoln to let people join this army, to build this army military up and create the Bureau of U.S. Colored Troops inside the branch of the military, so that he could bring these guys in, put them in uniform, turn them loose on these battlefields. And of these 209,000 names that are on the African-American Civil War Memorial that have now been recognized by the Guinness Book of World Records, here's the part that really fascinates me. 70 of these 209,000 men, 150,000 of them were enslaved when the war started. And you all know the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to those states that were in the South. It didn't apply to 4 border states. So it applied primarily to the Deep South, from Virginia to Texas. And so now Lincoln had found a way to get those men in uniform, get them trained on battlefields, but he had to get over some of his own trepidations about this. We hear him saying early in the war that if we put 50,000 arms in the hands of these enslaved people, they would be in the hands of their slaveholders by nightfall. Now that's describing somebody that's going to fall out on the battlefield or turn over his guns to who's not going to fight. And that's what he's saying in the war. About 2 or 3 years later, now he's saying the opposite. He's still talking about the Mississippi River now, that nothing will end this war faster than the sight of 50,000 armed soldiers, black ex-slaves, standing on the banks of the Mississippi River with bullets in their pockets and rifles on their shoulders. Hey man, he had a way with words, didn't he? When he got ready, he could make you feel like you were right there with him. Yeah, that's right. That would be an awful sight if you're a slaveholder around the Mississippi Delta, and now that rises up on the banks of the Mississippi River. Hey man, that's a pretty sight. to me right now when I think about it. And I'm sure it was a pretty sight to Lincoln. It put fear in the hearts of those Southerners. I can tell you that right now. And and you all know that a number of these soldiers were raised around the Mississippi River, which is a very interesting story in and of itself. But the largest number comes from Louisiana, which about 27,000 of these soldiers come from Louisiana. Second largest, which is on the Mississippi River. The second largest number comes from Kentucky, and the third largest from Tennessee. And then my favorite story, Mississippi has 17,000. Now I was in Mississippi last weekend. I went back to where I first heard about these soldiers. I went back to Holly Springs, Mississippi, Marshall County, which when I went over there in 1962 as a civil rights worker with SNCC, with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, there were virtually no Black people registered to vote. Now, I knew before we went over there that in the 1870s and 1880s, during Reconstruction, there had been a Black sheriff of Marshall County. The mayor of this town had been an African American. And yet by the time I got there were virtually no Black people registered to vote. And there I met a man named Henry Reeves who showed me his granddaddy's rifle and his uniform. And he told me a story about his granddaddy. And one of these days when I get old enough Alzheimer, I'm gonna tell people I knew that day I was gonna build a monument for these soldiers in the nation's capital. I'd be in Washington, D.C. I looked over on the long cotton rows and the other side of it. I saw a monument rising up in Washington, D.C. that will one day be recognized by the Guinness Book of World Records. Now, I ain't old enough to be lying like that yet. And my Alzheimer's hadn't kicked in on me yet, not enough. But one day, not too long from now, I'm going to start telling that story like that. So when people ask me how long did it take me to build it, I'm going to go back to 1962 when I first heard about it. It took a long time. I had to travel a lot of different places to get here. But if you know, as my grandmother used to say, if you be good and work hard, God will find a way for you to do what you need to do. So I see this as somewhat my duty to bring up these names because these are the names that saved the nation. If you think about this for a minute, I told you 150,000 were enslaved when the war started. They were living on these plantations. So when you pull one of these guys off a plantation, he's no longer growing cotton and corn and tobacco for the owner. He's no longer digging trenches for the Confederates. Now he's in a uniform. And I will tell you something about this. I was down there in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. I was driving a car with an antenna on the back. And we were running from the police and hiding from them all the time. And they still caught us too many times and put us in too many jailhouses. But you put a uniform on one of the former slaves, put them on the banks of the Mississippi River with U.S. on his shoulder, he better learn how to shoot if he want to live, because he's going to be a target. And not only is he a target, but the leaders of these regiments, the guys like Robert Gould Shaw, who commanded the Massachusetts 54th, are going to be a target too. Because if you watch them march over the parapet there at Fort Wagner, back in those days, the officers had to lead from out front. The officers were all white, and these guys all knew it. If you could pick them off, you had a regiment without officers in there. So they were targets. They were targets, and I know now they didn't let the Black people be officers. And I'm sure there were many of them who were just as good and maybe even more honorable and more radical and more of a soldier than some of these guys who were made officers. But I can tell you right now, if you were an officer in one of these regiments, you were a target for the Confederates. And in many of these cases, we know one down here in Virginia where these soldiers, where the officers are picked off, and the officers got Christian Fleetwood has to take over this regiment now because they picked off all the white officers. And Christian Fleetwood ends up fighting Fitzhugh Lee. Y'all recognize that name, right? He ends up fighting Fitzhugh Lee. They rout Fitzhugh Lee in a battle down there right outside of Petersburg, which is a part of the Richmond campaign. And so it's really an honor to be able to represent these guys and to pay tribute to them, because I think as we pay tribute to these soldiers, we pay tribute to President Abraham Lincoln. He knew at a point that he had to make a military decision to do this, because if he didn't do this, he might not have lost the war right away, but this thing was tearing the country down. You all know this already. They had riots in New York City already, draft riots, because these people didn't want to fight. And many of them were saying, why are we fighting when you got all these able-bodied Black men here in New York City and Baltimore and other places who want to fight? Why are we taking bullets when these guys want to fight? And they're the ones that are going to get their freedom anyway. Why don't you put them on the front line? So he had pressure on him from that side, as well as many of his officers are telling him that these men want to fight. Down in New Bern, North Carolina, we have a great story about a guy named Singleton. Singleton was a young man who had been sold off to Georgia. When the war started, he ran away and came back home to New Bern, North Carolina. And Singleton organized Black people to march around the base, military base there. Like the walls of Jericho, they were marching with broom handles and cotton stalks just to prove to the president. They get up in the morning and go marching at 5:30 because they still had to go to work. So they go march around the camp. And President Lincoln shows up down there one day, and the base commander tells President Lincoln, these guys want to fight. And Lincoln said, well, we're not ready yet. When we get ready, we're coming back to you. We're not ready yet. Singleton eventually helps to organize the 35th USCT Regiment there in New Bern, North Carolina. So these guys all wanted to fight. They took every opportunity they could get. They knew what was in it for them. And at the end of the day, Congress would reward them with the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution of the United States. Those amendments changed America. Before those amendments, America is a country that has almost 4 million slaves living in it. Slaves had no rights and no right to own property, no right to marriage, no right to anything in the country. It was against the law to teach them in some of these states, teach them how to read and write. When this war is over, not only do we have 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, but at the end of the war, Congress is talking about 40 acres and a mule. They're talking about reparations. And by the way, that field order that was issued by Sherman that talked about reparations included the whole coast of the United States, from Florida to Virginia. They were going to divide up those plantations and put them in the hands of those people who had been enslaved for all those years and who really needed something that they could do so they could make a living here in the United States of America. It was the right thing to do, you all. It didn't get done, but it was the right thing to do. Because it fits in with the history of slavery worldwide. You all know that slavery has been around for all these many years. Slavery is in the Bible, but slavery had some characteristics to it. In most countries, you couldn't be enslaved for more than 5 years. Mostly, the longest one I ever heard was 7 years. At the end of the time, you had to give the person who was enslaved some land and some money so they could start out. And by the way, at the end of slavery, they also regained their citizenship. Now, in the United States, they take away all of that. You get perpetual slavery where the child follows the condition of the mother. And then we end the war. We finally fight our way through the war to save the country and save ourselves. And there's no reparations at the end of the war. There's nothing that these people are given to fight to get started out here in the United States. Now, except for one thing, and I won't close with that. I grew up in Newton, Georgia. I went to Morehouse College in the 1960s. In 1960, I joined the Civil Rights Movement as soon as I could. At the end of my freshman year, I started getting arrested there in Atlanta. By the time I went to Mississippi, I was a veteran of the Civil Rights Movement. Morehouse College was built in 1867. By the time I went to college at Morehouse College, there were 110 Black colleges in the United States. There were thousands of public schools for Blacks in the United States, public and private schools. Some of those schools were built by the Roosevelt Foundation. The Roosevelt Foundation built 5,000 schools for African Americans. So when people talk about Reconstruction and try to define this as some kind of, I've heard some people say that African Americans were worse off after Reconstruction than they were in slavery. You never hear a Black person say that, by the way. I tell you that right now, because we know better. We also know that our community was beginning to thrive and to do to make some progress here in the United States. Thank God we were able to do it. We were able to do it because we did what we think everybody has to do in trying to make a life for themselves. We used schools, education, church, religion, God, and because one person said that we had churches and schools and churches, and they defined a school as any place where 3 people are together and one of them can read and write. That's how we got ourselves to the point where by the time President Obama runs for office, we go from 250,000 Blacks in college to about 2.5 million Blacks enrolled in college. Today, there's over 3 million Black people enrolled in college in the United States. Black people earn over $3 trillion in the United States. That figure a few years ago was greater than the GNP for Canada. It's a tremendous increase in average income and enrollment, mostly because of the Civil Rights Movement, which changed the country. We took the gains that were made by the Civil War, the 13th, 14th Amendments, and added to them the 64 Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voting Rights Act. And it was the Voting Rights Act that changed the country. It was the Voting Rights Act that gave us the right to vote. You go to many of these cities now in the South. I was just in Mississippi and Georgia. The mayors of major cities down there, African American, the mayors of Washington, D.C., all these cities. And these cities produce jobs that African Americans now can obtain because we have the political power. And then I'll close with this last one. Since I'm from Georgia, it was Georgia that saved us in the last election. I'm gonna say it again. It was Georgia that saved us in the last election. They gave us 2 senators, Ossoff and Warnock. And they gave us 12,000 votes that we needed real bad. Didn't hardly have enough to spare. Gave us 12,000. So why was I down there last week? Because I want to make sure they keep Georgia blue. That's right. Got to keep Georgia blue, y'all. Got to keep Georgia blue, because with progress that we made for all these years, got to continue to go forward. We can't go backwards. There's nothing back there but pain and agony. There is no glory back there, not for African Americans. I don't think there's any glory back there for America itself. Our glory lies ahead of us. Let's keep a good thing going. Let's keep on honoring the memory of Abraham Lincoln and these African American soldiers. Thank you all very much. May God continue to bless you, and may God continue to bless America.
Fernando from Venezuela says, can you guys hear me? Okay. Says, God bless you, Frank. We have a question from Asa. She has asked, was Lincoln an advocate for voting rights for Black Civil War veterans?
Yes, that's a very important question. The first report that we know of Lincoln support for African Americans voting rights, we find in a letter that he writes to the governor, I think, of Louisiana. Louisiana is trying to get back into the Union. They're writing a new state constitution. And in that constitution, they said they were going to allow educated Black people to vote in Louisiana. Lincoln hears about this and writes what he calls a private letter. He says, this letter is not for publication, but I want you to know I like what you're doing and letting African Americans vote. And also, I like the fact that it is the states that's doing this. So I think at that point, he will settle on trying to get the states to change voting rights to allow African American to vote. He was not thinking about a federal law, which was the 14th Amendment, which has voting rights, and the 15th Amendment. But that's the first that we know of. We know he was involved in the writing of the 13th Amendment. I don't think he was involved in the writing of the 14th Amendment. He was long dead by the time that gets written, and that's where voting rights first appear. But he did mention, and by the way, when he said that I like the fact you're letting middle-class Blacks vote in Louisiana, he also said, and you should allow those Black soldiers who served us so greatly, who served us in the Civil War to vote also. So he mentions them particularly.
I'd like to ask a question, Frank, since we booked this as Lincoln then and now. What do you think Lincoln would say now if he were here about the situation? We also do want to talk about your museum as well, but what do you think he would say right now?
Well, one thing that we get to do as as we look back is to imagine what we think might have been the case, and put ourselves in the same place. But I think that if you know anything about Lincoln, if you care anything about Lincoln, he loved this country. He really did love this country, and he was willing to try to do what he could, not only to save it, but he tried to save all of it. And if anything, he was too much of an accommodationist in some cases. Some people said it took him so long to win this war because he was trying to placate all sides. He had enough army to win it from the start. So, but he wanted to. He knew that one day that war was going to be over, and he was going to have to preside over a country that was going to have to live now without slavery and would have to live as one nation under God. So I think he would be distressed about what the situation that we find ourselves in. I don't know if he would be as worried about it as we are, because he would have gone through a military outbreak that he would have had to put down and manage. So he would have already seen much more of what we imagine to be bad than what we see now. So I don't know that he would be that concerned, but I do believe that he would definitely he would be a good leader for the times. There's no question about that. He would, but he loved the country, and I think that love of country and that willingness to stand up for what he believed in, the basic principles of this democracy, would make him a strong leader, and also would make him comfortable in the situation that we find ourselves in.
Thank you very much for that talk. First of all, where is the Memorial Museum located here? And also, where did you get your resource materials for, identifying all of these soldiers? And have you been able to get do you have any kind of a partnership with the African American Museum here at the Smithsonian or the new museum in Charleston? Thank you.
Well, this is America, and there's some good things about capitalism. If you got money, you can buy anything. So we bought it off a lot of what we have. There are many people who've been collectors of these materials for many years. But the most important dynamic for us was when we opened in 1998, we had almost 10,000 people come to Washington, D.C. Many of them were descendants. Think about this for a moment. This country might not have cared about these soldiers, but their parents cared about them, their children, their cousins. So these people had the letters, they had the discharge papers, they had the Mr. Reeves had his grandfather's uniform, he had his rifle. So when we opened up, I had no idea in the beginning that I was going to build a museum. I was thinking we were going to build a monument outside, put these names up, and go back to my rocking chair or something. But people showed up with their documents, and they wanted us to keep them because they were looking for a depository for them from somebody who cared about them. They knew when they died, their children were going to put this stuff in the trash. So they were thinking, okay, if I can get this stuff up there to somebody like Mr. Smith or Mr. Bill Dickinson or somebody who cares about it, put it in some kind of a situation where it can be saved. And so we ended up collecting a lot of material from these family members, and we are still collecting from these family members too, even to today. Although our collections are all done, our exhibits are in the can. We have people. We also have family members. We have a guy on one of our big donors who is actually the son of a Confederate soldier. Well, not the son, but I'm talking about five who's given us a good deal of money. But he also donated several weapons to us, 26 weapons that he had saved and he had collected over the years. And we're using some of those in our exhibits. So we get material from a lot of different places. There's a lot of material out here. There's no question about it. We also are working with, there's an Association of African American Museums. We're working with that association to hold workshops where we can show people how to preserve the material that they have. Because many of these family members don't want to give it up. They still don't want to give it up. They don't have a good place to put it. They don't have a good way to take care of it. They need a little advice. And maybe they'll lend it to some local museum if they don't want to send it all the way to Washington, D.C. We do have a Washington, D.C. address, y'all. Not everybody likes to send stuff up here because they think they're coming back to them forever. But it's been fun actually for me and because we provide an outlet for these families. We have a relationship with virtually all these museums because we do something very special. My museum, we have 209,000 names. We have 209,000 stories. There are millions of descendants of these soldiers living today. So we not only collect their documents, but we collect their stories. And I want to say something out loud about this right now. I was in Ireland. Actually, I was in Liverpool, England, and the Queen's mayor of Liverpool told me this story. She said she was Irish. She said, Frank Smith, she said, I don't think Black people ought to apologize for the fact that their history is oral. She said, our Irish history is oral. And she said, we enjoy telling the story, and we never tell it the same way twice. So you guys, you collect your oral histories because this may be the only really accurate history of the United States. We had some fun at dinner today talking about this. It depends on how you see the world. African Americans, when we write a history of what happened to us on these plantations, what happened to us in these fields, what happened to us as we tried to register to vote, That is an accurate history of what happened to us. It's an accurate history of America. Now, whether somebody else who's a learned scholar sees it that way or not, well, maybe not, but man, just I might not have studied it in school, but I lived it every day, walking up and down these roads, and I knew what it felt like. I knew what it felt like to my family. I knew what we had to do to make the community better. We knew what we had to do to survive and to make our children have a better life and make a contribution to this country. And that's an important history too, because there are people all over this world today who are struggling trying to get the kind of freedom that we have here in the United States. And what we say to them is, you may have to struggle too to get it. And I'll make one last point about that. When we get the State Department sends people to our museum now, and we had a collection of young people from Eastern Europe who were talking to me about the Civil Rights Movement. And I said, well, we picketed, went to jail, marched, did this. And so one of these young ladies got him. She said, well, if we did that in our country, we get put in jail. I said, well, sometimes, you just got to make sure you got enough people to go with you so you're not in there by yourself, and that the community will support what you're doing and things like that. But I think, it's interesting to talk to people who are trying to themselves throw off the shackle of oppression in their own country, in their own community where they live, and talk about democracy. And that's not just true in the East and other places like this, it's also true in Africa. Many of these African countries don't have very good, stable, democratic governments. And if they did so and had some orderly way to have an orderly transfer of power, many of them would have much better societies. They'd be much better able of growing and distributing the resources in those countries. They could have a good public school system so everybody can earn a decent living in their countries. Many of them certainly have enough money to do this with. They just don't have a good way to organize it. And so they could do with some lessons about how you struggle to make a place better, but you always struggle for a good purpose and for a good goal. And John Lewis said, make good trouble and good things will come out of it.
We have another question on the chat, and I see we have one here, but this is perfect time to mention this. I'm really looking forward to the fact that you've collected these stories is very important, but also you get to tell them. And we talk about that all the time is we want the right people to tell the story about their background. And so you have that opportunity. I noticed at the Freedom House, I know Bill has been involved in that. That's one that's telling it from the perspective of those who lived through it. And so I'm looking forward to your museum opening up so we can not only hear about that collection, but also hear those words and those stories and those collections. Okay, I know Paula's got a question. Fergus, you want to come up and ask that here?
No hard question.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm going to disappoint you in that. Well, first, thanks for your presentation. You talked at one point about interacting with the mayor, I guess, in Natchez and so on, and it's very interesting. I wonder if you've had any comparable interaction with the museum, such as it is at Fort Pillow in Tennessee. If there's anybody here who doesn't know about Fort Pillow, in a word or two, it's the site of the worst war crime committed on American soil outside the Indian Wars, when Nathan Bedford Forrest, pre-war slave trader, post-war leader of the Ku Klux Klan and war criminal, led the massacre of mostly Black troops, but including their white officers. There's a museum at the site. I've been there a couple of times, including about a few months ago. It is a Tennessee State Museum, which until recently merely said, what happened here is controversial. We don't know how to label it. It was controversial. And I was happy to see at least there's a modest display, very modest, about Black troops, which was not there 20 years ago. But at any rate, that's a museum that needs you. And it's not as if you have nothing else to do, I realize, but also it is one of the most significant events in the war that involved Black federal troops, and Americans need to know what happened there. So by way of, I have to make this a question, I guess. So I'm really asking, have you been in touch with them in any way at all? And I wouldn't say if not, why not, but that would.
Well, the answer is yes. We have had some interaction with them, some of which was not so fortunate, but there is an effort. You probably know this already, to have the Park Service take over that site. We've been involved in that ourselves because we don't trust the state of Tennessee to ever get it right, and so we hope that we can get it taken over by the Park Service. Then we got to get the Park Service to get it right, but we have a better chance of getting the Park Service. So I am involved with that effort. We have been there for reenactments with some of our people. We have a guy who works for who's affiliated with us, who is a descendant of one of the survivors who survived that massacre there at Fort Pillow. So he's leading the effort to try to get to get the federal government to take it over. We got it almost done last year, and somebody down there, which is interesting because the state doesn't really want it. They probably want to get rid of it. They just don't want to see us take it over. But yes, we've had a little bit of reaction, not so much success with them. But we have a grant now from the National Park Foundation to go to look at the way that the Park Service interprets African-American Civil War soldiers at Park Service sites. It's very interesting. You don't think about it till you think about it, that the Park Service operates most of these battlefields already. And in many of these cases, they have not had anything there about these African-American soldiers because they didn't want the controversy of local people coming up in there asking them why were they doing this. And I'll give you a quick, we were in June of last year, I took my staff down for the second time to the Vicksburg National Battlefield. There's 23,000 African-American soldiers buried in the Vicksburg battlefield. Huge number of African-American, over in a little section by themselves, sort of like Arlington, section 23. And, but they had very little there about African-American soldiers. We went back for the second time this year because we did a little field test to see what they were doing. And they've gotten better, but it's taking some effort. These Park Service sites were flying these Confederate battle flags for all these years. Nobody ever said anything to them about them until we challenged them. And then they started taking them down. The Black Lives Matter movement really was the one that went out. We didn't ever take any of them down. Some of these Black Lives Matter people were climbing up these poles, taking these flags down. So that had an impact all over the world too, by the way. You all know that, right? There were places in Liverpool, England, and other places where these people earned money and benefited from all these soldiers from slavery, where people were taking down those symbols too, as a part of that whole movement. But yeah, we've done a little bit with that place down in Tennessee. I hope we can get one day take it over and do a better job.
So thank you, by the way, for your talk. In addition to Douglas, it seems that a number of the Union commanders or significant officers from Grant to Sherman to Butler were sort of ahead of Lincoln in thinking about things. To what extent did senior military officers influence Lincoln as the war progressed in terms of emancipation and ultimately African-American liberties?
Well, I think that I told you I was in Mississippi last weekend and Georgia the week before. I was in Holly Springs, Mississippi. And one of the things I learned when I was in Holly Springs was at one point, General Grant, had his wife moved down there for almost 2 years in the middle of the war from 61 to 63. She was living in Holly Springs. And of course, I'm sure it was a compound probably when she was living there with a bunch of soldiers protecting it. But what I saw from that was that I just think Grant's papers, by the way, are at Mississippi State College in Starkville, Mississippi, which that surprised me. I learned that 2 years ago. That really surprised me. But now that I know his wife lived there for a while, he was there for a long time. I can see how they might have ended up with their papers there in the state of Mississippi. But yeah, the soldiers were, remember, these guys were in the field for a long time. Grant and Sherman were together in Vicksburg for almost 2 years. trying to take that, and they got to know all of these young soldiers around there. These guys were giving Grant, and before they got into the Army, they were giving Grant and Sherman intelligence about which they actually were the ones that showed them how to get a shortcut around that canal over there so they could finally take Vicksburg. The story that I told you about this young guy who was on my board, whose great-great-grandfather fought in the war, he actually ends up in the Army because his slave owner had remember the Confederacy, if you own more than a certain number of slaves, you had to send some of your slaves to the front to help with the building of the fortifications and things like that. And so Lee's great-great-grandfather got sent up there by his owner to go work for the Confederacy. They get up there. This is their story. Now, that's why I laugh. This is an accurate description of what happened because the family members told this story. They get up there and they say, one of the guys who can read a little bit sees a flyer that says that the Union Army on that side is trying to defeat slavery. These guys look at each other and say, hey, man, we're supposed to be over there. Let's go. They go over there to the other side, and now for a little while they're working for the Union Army, except now they're getting paid $7 a month. That looked like a pretty good deal. So the Army knew that these people wanted to fight. They knew that they were aiding them and abetting them all the time. They were trying to find ways to help. They didn't have an escape hatch. They still had to return back to that plantation if the Union Army didn't let them in. And in some cases, they followed the Army around. You all know this great story about when Sherman's Army. I'll tell you a quick story here since I was born in Georgia. When Sherman's Army reaches the north part of it, Georgia, coming out of Tennessee, there's a little over 1 million people living in the state of Georgia. 440,000 of them are enslaved. 440,000 or 1.1 million people are enslaved. And as that army moves south, I told you if you had a bleeding map, you could show this. That army moves south. These people are being freed as the army moves south on its way to Georgia. So I'm in Atlanta talking to the Atlanta Historical Society, and they're talking about how Atlanta was such a jewel with all these big homes in them and fancy people and Gone with the Wind, and all this got destroyed by this marauding army that was coming. I swear that's one way to look at this. But if you were one of those 440,000 people, first time you heard a gunshot, you probably thought, man, mine eyes have heard the glory of the coming of the Lord. So that's another way to look at the story. And we won. So you can so now they were talking about what they were going to do with that diorama. You all know about the great diorama they've had for all these years. It was in a public park. The mayor of Atlanta, who controls the public parks, one of the African American mayor, went to Howard Law School here. He found $10 million to buy this thing so he could put it in mothballs. Now, I could have found something better to do with $10 million than that, but they didn't ask me. But now that they've got this thing, now they've got to figure out how to reinterpret it. So they asked me to come down there to help them figure out how to interpret. Now, he said the right thing. The mayor of Atlanta said the right thing. He said, this was the war from which my family got its freedom. And Sherman's Army was a part of that freedom. That's what he said. He said, I know this is not telling the right story, but I'm taking it down because I want to get it out of the public. I don't care what they do with it. It's coming out of my park. So out of the city park. It was at Grant Park in Atlanta. So they finally put it up at this museum. So the museum came ask me to help them figure out how to reinterpret. So what I said to them was, look, it's too big a story. Somebody had already tampered with it. You know, Clark Gable, they asked Clark Gable what he thought about it. Clark said, I like it, but it doesn't have an image of me up there. So they found some soldier, put some sideburns on him and a mustache so he looked like Clark Gable. They had a scene where a Union soldier were capturing some Confederates. They said, well, we can't have that on here. So they put Confederate uniforms on all of them. So they wouldn't have the Union, have anybody spending. So they'd already tampered with this thing already. And being a museum operator, I'm not going to tell you to tamper with a damn piece of art. So I said, look, y'all can do what y'all want to do with this. But what you do is you develop another story. And you tell this story right here about these people, this army going south and freeing all these people. That's what Sherman's Army was all about. That's what the Civil War was all about. And this was made possible because all these African-American soldiers, at that army approached Atlanta, they created three black regiments in Atlanta. When they moved out of Atlanta, they left Atlanta on a martial law. There were African-American soldiers who were the MPs in the city of Atlanta when Sherman's Army went through there. They don't want to tell that story because it's embarrassing that they have put all their effort and all their energy into trying to straighten this out. But that's the real story. And that's just, if they learn to tell their story, they can tell a real story about Atlanta. Now we can talk about Atlanta being a place that is a land of opportunity. There are 3 or 4 black colleges. I went to Morehouse College there in Atlanta. That's where it should control Georgia. They should. They got Emory and Georgia Tech, and they got Morehouse and Spelman and Clark. They got all the intelligentsia of the state of Georgia. They should control the state, but they control it as free people. You can't control it as one group dominating another, one group free, another group enslaved, one group going to school. You don't have schools for others. That is not a great place to live. It's not a great place for anybody. And it can only be great when they got rid of this awful institution of slavery and Jim Crow, by the way, which follows it on its heels. Yes, ma'am.
All right, thank you. 2 things. One is if you could talk a little bit about recruitments of USCT in our area and then DMV. And then, yeah. And then also, I remember going to you have sort of a storefront, kind of a couple room museum a few years ago. So is there anything indoors to visit now, or is it?
Okay, so Washington, D.C. did recruit a regiment called had another name, but now it's the first USCT. That was created here in Washington, D.C. Actually, it was formed at a church, which was, and since I'm in Washington, D.C., you know what a Ray Martin office building is? There's a parking lot behind the building. At the time of the Civil War, there was a black church there, Israel AME Church. Israel still exists. It's up on Water Street up here now. They took the property from, and there was a preacher there named Henry McNeil Turner. I see some people shaking their heads. Henry McNeil Turner, I mentioned his name because there have been several efforts to try to recruit a black regiment in D.C. One night, Henry McNeil Turner had a meeting. He signed up 600 African-American soldiers to create the first United States colored troops. We have a young man that was shown on that video here earlier who wears a uniform. We call him our living artifact. His name is Marquette Milton. And Marquette Milton, I trained him to be a docent. So here's how you train. Civil War is so complicated, most people don't understand it. I don't even understand all of it myself. So I said, okay, if you bite it off in little chunks, you can probably understand it. So I had him go through the files of this monument, through all the files of this regiment. He found a soldier that was about 25 years old. He was 25 at the time. He was kind of slightly built, skinny little dude. He found him and he started working on his background. We looked him up. He got a pension. He was born here in D.C. He's freed, by the way, on D.C. Emancipation Day on April 16th. And then he took his freedom and joined the Army. He didn't take his freedom and run away somewhere and hide it behind a bush. He joined the Union Army. So Marquette brought that guy alive. And he tells that story up on U Street all the time. So if you haven't heard this, you really got to get a treat of your life. But he was a young man who was recruited here in Washington, D.C. He lived through the war. He had one heck of a military campaign. He went down to City Point down in Virginia. They were in North Carolina at the Battle of what's his name down in North Carolina, and then they were here. They came back. I don't know if they went to Appomattox or not, but I know they were in Richmond. They were part of the group that marched into Richmond. So it was really a storied regiment that was formed here in the District of Columbia, and there was a total of 156 regiments. They fought in, I don't know, a couple hundred campaigns, some of which you know about already. There were 23 Medal of Honor recipients who were African Americans in the Civil War. So let me just say that America doesn't award any other medals of honor until President Clinton awards, I think, 4, 5, 7, I believe, medals posthumously to blacks who were in World War II. With all the heroism of the Tuskegee Airmen and all those other regiments, there are no other medals of honor. Now, there's some reasons for that, which I won't go into, but one of them is because after the Civil War, blacks are not allowed. You win medals with boots on the ground. It's the guys who are on the ground that are out there catching people and catching bullets too, by the way, that they win the medals. If you're not able to be in those infantry units, now it's coming home to you, all right? Because what you see in World War II are all these supply units that are supplying the Union Army. They're running gasoline and food. Not that that's not important, Not that that's not important, but that's not where you win the congressional medals. That's not what you get a congressional medal awarded for. Most of these guys get the Congressional Medal of Honor from their involvement as flag bearers in these regiments. Flag bearers. Next to that white officer I was telling you about is the guy who's carrying the flag. And that guy who's carrying the flag might be more of a target than that white officer. Because you knock the flag down, what's the purpose of the flag? So the men who are following behind can know which way their leaders are going. They follow the flag. That's why you got to have somebody pick it up if it gets blood, if it gets, and that's the guy that's a real target. He and that white officer, they're all real targets. So, and that's why when you look at these congressional medals for these guys right here, most of them got the medal from carrying the flag because there were more injuries, more deaths from flag bearers than anything else. There were a number of guys who really did well, and I feel like as a civil rights worker in Mississippi, I'm going to close on this, y'all. I'm tired, so let me just close with this. By the time I went to Mississippi in 1962, by the time we came to the March on Washington in 63, 200,000 people, 250,000 people here, I knew something was going to happen. I did not believe that the country could turn its back. By the way, they say it was 250,000 people. Look like 1 million people to me. I had never seen that many people anywhere in my life. And they were mostly white, but more than half of them were white too, by the way. I knew by then that the country couldn't turn its back on this forever, that they had to be some way for this issue to be resolved. It was too crazy. It was too violent. It was too, I'm going to say, messed up. But I'll tell you, whatever thrill I might have felt at being a part of that civil rights movement, it pales in the face of thinking about one of these soldiers who've been born on one of these plantations. He never had any promise of freedom in his life. And then here comes somebody from the U.S. Army saying, you know what? If you join us, we'll put bullets in your pockets and rifles on your shoulders. You'll be able to walk out on that battlefield and you might be able to shoot somebody. Hey, man. And what you see is these families joining up. One person named Smith from this plantation joined up, 7 people named Smith. All your brothers come home, sisters. Because after a while, your mother be looking at you saying, you ain't doing nothing, no way. You might as well join the Army. At least you get paid a little bit of money. All you do is hanging around here my way, eating up everything. And your girlfriend won't give you no date if you don't do something. And your wife, that's what happened to the civil rights movement. That's why we got so many people in the movement. Once the women join, the guys got to join. Because if they don't join, they can't get no date. So it's, but it was it must have been, it's hard to imagine what it must have felt like for them. And they felt like they'd done something worthwhile to help save the country. And Abraham Lincoln was their hero. When you go in the black community all over these southern states, you see a Lincoln High School everywhere. If you want to know where the black neighborhood is, find a street named Lincoln. I said it out loud. If you want to know where the black neighborhood is in the South, find a street named Lincoln. Then white people don't name anything after Abraham Lincoln down there. Lincoln High School is in the black neighborhood. Lincoln Center is in the black neighborhood. We love Lincoln, and we respect him, we adore him, and that's why we're putting another monument up in front of where his soldiers are, the guys who helped him save this nation and give it really the power that it deserves to be the leading democratic country anywhere in the world. So thank you all very much for having me. May God continue to bless you. May God continue to bless America.
Dr. Smith he speaks of his staff. When we talk about staffs here in Washington, we're usually talking about 10s or 20s or 100s. He has a staff of 3. It will become 8. Still, this is a pretty small force. And they're trying to raise money, and they're doing pretty well for the money for the build out. But they're going to be operating a museum open to the public next spring. The gentleman in the center, of course, you recognize him. The man on the right is what I call the Pied Piper of U Street. Living artifact, Marquette. A charming guy. To see him out there interacting with the public, particularly the kids. You see those kids, and they look at him, and he tells the story of their ancestors. Don't think that doesn't make an impact, a huge impact. Their ancestors fought for their freedom. Their freedom was not given to them. You may have helped, but they fought for it also. And the gentleman on the red-headed gentleman is the mayor of Natchez, Mississippi. And they're getting the story down there. Of all places, Natchez, Mississippi, where they still have their balls in Confederate uniforms and dresses and things like that. Incredible. But that's where the Forks of the Road was, and that's where the other end of the slave trade that was going on in Alexandria was located, that Frank talked about. And those slave pens that were then in 1863, and the Union Army came in and said, okay, boys, you can go home. They said, where's home? The U.S. Army be glad to have you. And that was all about. The other one, right across the street, you'll see a building there. That's the old Grimpsey School. And you'll notice in the front, there's a little porch. See it, but anyhow, there'll be a statue put there right across the street from the monument. And that will be a statue of Abraham Lincoln, creating the relationship between Abraham Lincoln and his signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. And then if we could just get a quick picture of the statue. There is Lincoln. It's on the sidewalk right now. And that one, it was paid for by small donations. Frank told me, you know, a lot of chicken dinners and GoFundMe. But it came, not a big grant. There's not big money in this. But yet when he opens up his museum, there's a lot of expenses there and he needs help. And so we have to reach out and find some large donors. We'll take small ones too. And Frank and I we've made arrangements, so some larger arrangements, so larger foundations can make money. People can donate appreciated stock, whatever their donor advised funds, things like that. We have a ways to go. But as I said, this man is persistent, but he needs help. And that's going to have to come from all of us, black and white. So Frank, thank you for coming.